Aloha, everyone, online and in person for our first significant hybrid event for our East-West Center Insights. I am Suzanne Vares-Lum, president of the East-West Center in Honolulu, Hawaii, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's presentation, After the Invasion, featuring our own Vice President, Dr. Satu Limaye, located here in Honolulu, Hawaii, although he's actually works usually day to day in Washington, D.C., so we're so honored to have him here on our island. Today's East-West Center Insights is particularly special because it is our first hybrid talk since the onset of the pandemic, and I can hear some feedback just for our tech team. So just a quick synopsis. Just days before Russia invaded Ukraine, the Biden administration released its Indo-Pacific Strategy, providing continuity in the U.S. policy of prioritizing the Indo-Pacific and the pacing threat of China. In addition, the Indo-Pacific Strategy now confronts an ongoing land war in Europe and the specter of even closer Sino-Russian cooperation. Today, we are honored to have Dr. Satu Limaye, who offer a perspective on how Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the Indo-Pacific responses to it are affecting U.S. relations with the Indo-Pacific region. He will also assess key facets of the Biden administration's Indo-Pacific strategy and how they are developing amidst global challenges and regional developments. So a little bit about our featured speaker today, and we are so honored again to have him here. As I mentioned, he is the Vice President of the East-West Center, and he is also the Director of our Washington, D.C. office. He has created and now directs a very important program, Asia Matters for America Initiative, and is the founding editor of the Asia Pacific Bulletin. He is also the senior advisor at the CNA Corp, the Center for Naval Analyses. He's also a graduate of Georgetown University and received his doctorate from Oxford University, where he was a George C. Marshall Scholar. He publishes and speaks widely on Indo-Pacific regional issues and supports various U.S. government, foundation, fellowship, and professional organizations. Among his current affiliations are the Center for New American Security, Task Force on U.S.-Philippines Alliance, and the United States Institute of Peace Senior Study Group on North Pacific, Project 2049 Study Group on the U.S.-Australia Alliance, the Korea Economic Institute Advisory Council, and the Global Taiwan Institute Taiwan Asia Exchange Foundation Project. So as you can see, he is the perfect person to speak on this topic. And before I turn it over to the person you're waiting to hear to speak, I want to go over a few housekeeping notes. So after Dr. Limaye's presentation, we will have about 30 minutes to ask him questions. We will alternate between questions from our in-person audience there, and thank you all for coming in person, and our online audience. And for our online audience, please submit your questions through the Q&A feature. And for our in-person audience, just go ahead and do the old-fashioned way and raise your hand, and our staff will bring you a microphone. This webinar will be recorded and will be available for later viewing on the East-West Center's YouTube channel, which you can find on our website. Now, it is with great pleasure to welcome our honored speaker, our Vice President, Dr. Satu Limaye. Satu, over to you.
Well, let me start from the beginning by thanking President Vares-Lum for the invitation to give these remarks. It's part of our East-West Insight series, and needless to say, I'm honored and it's a real pleasure to be able to be part of the first hybrid one since we've opened up in April. So welcome to all of you in person as well as online, and we'll try to do our best here in the next 30 minutes, 20 or so minutes to give you an overview, and then I hope we'll engage in a very robust discussion and Q&A. That's the purpose of these Insight seminars. So, of course, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, this horrific military conflict that's going on at the heart of Europe, frames the discussion about where we are in U.S.-Asia Pacific relations. But I'd also flag two other contextuals. One is the release of the Indo-Pacific Strategy just a week before, as Susie mentioned. And the second is the sort of one-year mark of the new administration. Not to mention that some things are coming up, looming, and I hesitate to even think this far ahead, but certainly the November elections, but also the 2024 presidential elections. So that's the kind of two parentheses in which I think of this. The 1-year mark, release of the strategy, the invasion of Ukraine on one side, the left parentheses, and sort of outcome events looking down the road. This is a vast topic. There's lots of directions one could take, but I want to focus on 6 issues of US Indo-Pacific relations that I think merit considering where we are now and where the Ukraine issue has affected, so that we can kind of calibrate what's happening, what might happen, and then close with some larger structural questions and issues. What are these 6 issues? First, the attention to Asia, the so-called pivot to Asia. The second is how our relationships with our allies and partners are faring. The third is China policy, the central issue of China. Fourth is multilateralism and our regional engagement on multilateral institutions, old ones and new ones. And finally, fifth, commerce and economic security and engagement with the region. And finally, order. And when I say order, what I mean really is rules, norms, and institutions. So let me start with the status of attention to Asia. I think one of the points that the Indo-Pacific Strategy makes upfront, and quite unusually for an administration document, is that it speaks to continuity across 3 decades of engagement on the Indo-Pacific. So it goes back 2 decades, back to the George W. Bush administration. And in fact, in the opening pages of the strategy, it talks about how the George W. Bush administration, the Obama administration, the Trump administration, and now the Biden administration have all privileged or focused on the Indo-Pacific. So that continuity is really heavily emphasized. There are a couple other features I just flag about why our attention to Asia remains very high. It's the first time that a US administration has issued a national strategy before on a particular region before its other strategies around. So before the national security strategy, before the national defense strategy. It's the first time there's been a national strategy on a particular region in US history, and it's on the Indo-Pacific. So this gives you an example of just the, if you will, the primacy given to this region. There are also questions about a China strategy and how it will fit into this larger Indo-Pacific strategy. I have no idea when that will or if it will come out, but it's been talked about. And that begs the question, what has the invasion in Ukraine done to the primacy of the Indo-Pacific? Because friends in the region, people at home, elsewhere ask, are you going to be able to keep attention on Asia if you have these things, horrific things happening in the center of Europe? Or will you be distracted? Because there is a perception that despite the focus on the Indo-Pacific in previous administrations, it's either been suboptimal or not sustained or gone up and down. So the real question is, my answer to that is, I very much think that this is here to stay, the focus on the Indo-Pacific. The question of how much resources, how much focus will reveal themselves in time. But I certainly think the durability of attention issue has been answered. And I'll indicate why I think it's been answered. So give you some evidence. First, despite the conflict in Europe and conflict in Ukraine, the administration has held major meetings with its allies and partners, including recently, last week, a 2+2 meeting with India, with the Defense and Secretary of State. They've held an upcoming Quad meeting is expected to be held in May. They've just announced in May a US-ASEAN summit. Our White House czar or head of Indo-Pacific issues, Mr. Kurt Campbell, will be going to the Solomons along with Assistant Secretary Daniel Crittenbrink. And there's been a flurry of both virtual as well as in-person cabinet level and other senior official consultations in the region. So for those who question whether the Ukraine crisis has shifted our attention from Asia, my response is overall, despite the Ukraine, needless to say, taking up energy, resources, time, and effort of the administration, there's been very little evidence to me that the Indo-Pacific is being sidelined, being ignored. Indeed, because of the Ukraine crisis, which I'll get to, number of positive developments have been going on. with our allies and partners. So let me turn to the second issue, which is allies and partners. First, the Biden administration took office with a series of high-level engagements with Japan and Korea, 2 summits right away in the middle of COVID. They also held a leaders summit between the so-called Quad leaders, which is Australia, Japan, the United States, and India. First time ever that was done. They had major relationships with India bilaterally as well. They pay considerable attention after the first 6 months to Southeast Asia. And there has been, as many of you in the audience know, increased focus on the Pacific Islands, which picked up from the previous administration. The Trump administration was also beginning to pay more and more attention to the Pacific Islands, including the first ever White House visit of the 3 leaders of the 3 associated states. So the bottom line is, even before Ukraine, we had a very substantial engagement at the highest levels across Asia. Well, what has the invasion done to that? I would argue that it's largely strengthened those alliance and partner relations. Indeed, I would argue that if people talk about the coherence of NATO in response to Ukraine, our key allies in the Asia Pacific region, Australia, Japan, the Republic of Korea, New Zealand, strategic partners such as Singapore, and of course Taiwan, have all been very important in responding to the Ukraine invasion. So I'm not suggesting that's a NATO by any stretch. What I'm suggesting that our key strategic partnerships, longstanding relationships and alliance relationships have in fact gone into high gear in the context of the Ukraine invasion, and very productive. There have also been some surprises. Needless to say, 2 surprises for many people have been India and Vietnam. I particularly am not surprised by India and Vietnam's response. I would have been surprised if India and Vietnam had completely backed all elements of the US response, UN voting, sanctions, etc. But we can talk about that in the Q&A, because I do think that India and Vietnam surprised some people because of the progress that has been made in the last few years in both relationships. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, meaning the countries of Southeast Asia, had a very mixed response. There have been some elements of support objecting to the Russian invasion, mixed views about sanctions, abstentions by some, such as Vietnam, for example, but also strong support. For example, Singapore has been highly supportive of the US position. In fact, the Singaporean Prime Minister was in Washington last week. The Pacific Islands have also all voted together in the United Nations in opposing the invasion. And the question about sanctions, I don't know exactly what position they've taken on individual sanctions elements, but certainly in the UN, they have voted consistently to support. What this has done, in my view, is allowed not only the coherence of alliance and partnership relationships, but also the expansion of some relationships. Even despite India's vote and India's abstention in the UN, the 2+2 dialogue went on, and India has already agreed to participate in the next Quad leaders meeting. So it has not derailed that. Despite the mixed response of the Southeast Asian countries and only a 2-paragraph statement by the ASEAN as an organization, which did not use the word Russia, nevertheless, we're having an ASEAN summit in the first part of next month. So my simple point is, while it has not been what might be considered consistent or utterly on side in the way that a US administration would like, the overall Asian response to the Ukraine crisis has cemented and facilitated continued overall good relationships with the region. Let me turn to a really big issue, which is China. What does the Ukraine invasion and the current state of US-China policy mean? And we're not going to be able to answer this in a 15-20-minute overview of the region, but I'll just highlight 3 or 4 factors. It's very clear what the Indo-Pacific Strategy says. Coercion and aggression by China, mounting challenges, particularly from the PRC, and that US policy, and I'm quoting from the document, our objective is not to change the PRC, but shape a strategic environment and build a balance of influence favorable to the United States and its allies. So as you can see, China is a central part of this Indo-Pacific engagement and this Indo-Pacific strategy, and it's clearly one of grave and central concern to US policymakers. Now, what has the invasion done to them? My assessment is it's done basically 3 or 4 really big things. First, it's brought even more scrutiny on China because of the Sino-Russian relationship. And we can discuss, there are many interpretations, many assessments, differing opposite assessments of the state of Sino-Russian relations. But my own sense is that the China centrality of the US Indo-Pacific strategy is increased after the invasion because of the meeting between President Putin and President Xi prior to the invasion and all the elements that went in. We can discuss that in detail. The second thing that has happened is that it is focused on the potential Chinese threat to Taiwan. Inevitably, the question is being raised and asked all over the world and in governments and think tanks and academia and the media. What does this mean for Taiwan? Will there be a similar action? And what are the implications of a Sino-Russian relationship for potential Chinese military action on Taiwan? Again, hardly a simple answer, but I think it's focused even more attention, though this was hardly a new issue, but it certainly heightened in intensity. The third issue is that it has created a fundamental issue of whether US and China are on a path to further decoupling and deglobalization as a result of the way in which economic sanctions, response to dollar supremacy, and other things are developed. Will this mean that, in fact, that the United States and China are pushed towards even more decoupling, both by a set of choices vis-a-vis each other, but on their own? China taking actions to de-link itself from the international financial system via crypto, via barter arrangements, via more use of the renminbi, et cetera. So all of these options, I think. So those are my 3 big issues. What's my assessment? I should tell you where I sit on these issues. My assessment is that China is looking both on the Sino-Russian relationship and overall, I'm inclined to agree that there is likely to be more caution rather than less caution about military action on Taiwan. Now, let me be very clear. This is not to suggest that China does not claim Taiwan or want eventually to reunify on its terms with Taiwan. What I'm suggesting is that my own reading of the case is that China will probably take a second look at immediate near-term military action to invade Taiwan for a host of reasons as they watch events unfold 50 plus days in Ukraine. And that goes to military equipment, Ukraine's tactical and asymmetrical use of force, Western supply of Ukraine, clearly mistakes on the part of the Russian military, et cetera, et cetera. So one could disagree on that. There are lots of different assessments, but that's kind of where I come down on the issue. The fourth issue I said I would highlight is multilaterals. As you know, over the last 20 years, there have been a steady development of a range of multilateral institutions in the region. These include, for example, the longstanding ASEAN, to be sure, but US docking on as a dialogue partner, but also the East Asia Summit. There's APEC, and there's a whole host of organizations. What has the Ukraine crisis done to it? Well, the Indo-Pacific Strategy continues to mention and note all of the organizations that we, the United States, is active in. APEC, ASEAN, Pacific Islands Forum, ASEAN Regional Forum, etc. But it is also very clear, it seems to me, that there has been a developing trajectory and trend towards new institutions that are much more minilateral and bespoke coalitions. What are examples of this? I've mentioned the Quad repeatedly, but I would cite that as an example that's not one of the ASEAN-led organizations and created a certain degree of agita among certain Southeast Asian countries when it was created. I would flag the Australia, UK, US agreement, the so-called AUKUS agreement, which would eventually build nuclear-powered submarines in Australia, but also has a component on cooperation on high technology. So I think the overall trend is not a jettisoning or an abandonment of previous institutions that have worked in the region over the past 20 years, but certainly less emphasis on those and more on these new bespoke elements. What does that mean for relations with the region, which created some of these institutions? First, I think regional countries continue to be mixed in their own views of regional institutions. ASEAN, even amongst Southeast Asian countries who are full members, has a mixed record, and there are varying views about its utility and its effectiveness. Similarly, in the Pacific Islands region, we've seen mixed views about the PIF and some dissonance in the way in which PIF is managed. So the organizations themselves have had their own problems. The second assessment I would make is that these new bespoke organizations generally are accepted in the region because they are a sign of engagement and commitment of the United States. In other words, they don't presage a US departure, they presage a more active and engaged and committed US role. Certainly AUKUS does, certainly Quad does, certainly such new mechanisms. Now, I will end on one kind of note of caution. Because Indo-Pacific countries are chairs of some of these key institutions, I'll give you an example. Indonesia is chair of the G20. Thailand is the chair of APEC this year. Cambodia is the chair of ASEAN and therefore is hosting things like the ASEAN Regional Forum this summer. And then in the fall, the East Asia Summit. What it means for them, frankly, is it complicates their life, because there could be some increasing tension over the coming months as the war unfolds in Ukraine, that there will be pressure to push Russia out. And that could create some complexity for these countries who are chairs and have to manage these relationships. Or it could, I don't imagine necessarily it would, we don't know, but what if the US refused to show up if Russia attended these meetings over the coming months? And you saw today in the newspaper already that, for example, a meeting that was held, I believe it was at the G7 meeting or the G20 meeting, finance ministers, that Secretary of Treasury, Arch Secretary of Treasury, Ms. Yellen, left the meeting when the Russian representative spoke. So you can see this dissonance, and Indo-Pacific is caught between it, especially when they're chairing it and trying to host this. So that does create a certain degree of management issues for the relationships with those partners. The fifth issue I said I would mention relates to economic prosperity, and I'll be very brief on this. All of you know the story on the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the multilateral trading agreement that the United States chose to pull out of during the Trump administration, and now is a successor agreement called the Comprehensive Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I believe has 11 members. I'm not sure all have ratified. Maybe, I think perhaps Malaysia has not yet ratified. So this is being replaced by a new initiative that was highlighted in the Indo-Pacific Strategy, and that's called the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, because we need an acronym, another acronym in the international relations business. And this is the new hope for plussing up the US economic and commercial presence in the region. There's a slight problem, which is that we don't know the full measure of IPEF. We don't know what all it includes, and we don't know the details, modalities, and mechanisms. And we know so far there has been no support for increased market access into the United States. So issues such as the generalized system of preferences for particular countries in the region, the issues of a bilateral trading arrangement, the issue of market access, the issue of what kind of document are people signing? Is it a framework that is a legal document? Is it an instrument? These issues are not yet answered because there's not a formal submission. US Trade Representative Catherine Tai just consulted with the Philippines and with Taiwan, both of whom expressed an interest in joining IPEF. Under which parts, how much, how far they're willing to go, all remains to be seen. So I'll simply close on the economic pillar by saying this, to my mind, is the most important unmet need in the region right now, is US commercial and economic strategy. And until this is sorted out, other issues such as multilateralism, ongoing alliances and partnerships will remain will remain perhaps of less interest and importance than sorting out our economic. The final issue is on order. And here too, I'll be very brief. The Ukraine invasion has brought up lots of issues related to the coherence of the West. But if you look at the numbers of the voting, UN support on sanctions, abstentions, and others, as people have pointed out, nearly a majority, not quite a majority of the world's population is in countries that did not align with the West. And there remain a whole host of issues and considerations that include things like the West's moral leadership. Why does the world, people are asking in op-eds at regional governments, regional intellectuals, why do we have to follow Western moral leadership when the West did not respond in the same way on Syria or on Iraq or other? I'm simply pointing out that these issues and debates are important. A second issue is that we can't assume that everyone in the Indo-Pacific shares what might be considered Western values, or even for that matter, universal values. India is the world's biggest democracy, but it did not align on the voting and some of the issues related to sanctions, much to the disappointment of the administration. And then finally, there is, of course, resentment about sanctions. There is a view that that tool is particularly used by the West in, let's call it from the vantage point of those countries, unfair ways or inconsistent ways. I'm not going to debate all of this. You could say lots of things. For example, there's been no, we could say about direct targeting versus inadvertent targeting, et cetera, of civilian population. But the point is there are these dissonances about order, rules, and values, and they're not going to go away quickly, even if there is alignment on practical policy issues. Let me conclude by making, I think, 3 or 4 really kind of questions that are raised. My net assessment is that US relations with the Indo-Pacific after Ukraine are generally manageable, constructive, cooperative, and productive. We have to get the Indo-Pacific economic framework part in place. But there are a lot of questions that remain unanswered. For example, will the stability of the Indo-Pacific continue to be maintained if China continues what is regionally seen, and certainly in the US, as continued assertion and aggressiveness, whether it's in the East China Sea, South China Sea, or on Taiwan? Second, just how far will the Sino-Russian relationship develop? And will it become sort of a early Cold War element of the regional fixture? Third, I think it's really important to understand that there are structural issues that the Ukraine war has brought up that remain unanswered. And Ben and I were talking just before the program, for example, can deterrence work? It hasn't seemed to work in the case of deterring Russia and Ukraine. Will dissuasion work? So far, sanctions have had very limited impact on Russia's behavior in Ukraine, despite what are billed as the most extensive, deepest, most intense sanctions ever levied against a country. And so there are a number of issues, I would say, that well beyond just US Indo-Pacific relations remain unanswered. And depending on the end game of the Ukraine war and how that off-ramps or ends will determine, to my view, just how these central questions that the Indo-Pacific relies on the US for will be answered. For example, will the US deterrence and dissuasion work vis-a-vis China or Taiwan? What kinds of sanctions would work on China if they're delinked from the international globalization project? Will US allies really get in the game vis-a-vis Taiwan or South China Sea or East China Sea in the way, for example, that NATO and European allies have on the Ukraine question? So these are unknowns. I certainly don't know them, but I end with questions because I think we're 50 plus days into this war and we remain watchful, but I think it's very much important to understand that there are a lot of unanswered questions as we go forward in US Indo-Pacific relations. So thank you very much.
Mahalo nui loa, and thank you so much, Dr. Limaye, and thank you everyone. I know that you found it just as insightful and helpful to hear from our own Vice President about these key and critical issues. And thank you for your care and concern for what's happening in the region, as well as your support of the East-West Center. I want to let you know that there will be a recording of today's webinar that will be available for viewing on East-West Center's YouTube channel, again, where you can find other events located on our website. Our next East-West Center Insights event is actually later this afternoon at 2 p.m. Hawaii Standard Time, featuring Dr. Micah Fisher, Inundated, Jakarta Floods, and Capital Relocation in Indonesia. And on April 21st, we have our next Engendering Pacific Stories, focusing on guiding our youth, the next generation of leaders. We hope that you can join us for these events as well as future events. And thank you again. Mahalo nui loa.